What if the desert isn't silent at all? What if every grain of sand beneath the pyramids of Teotihuacan holds a memory of something once magnificent, now sleeping beneath the weight of centuries? They say the wind carries whispers across the Valley of Mexico. But maybe those whispers aren't just wind. Maybe they're echoes from a world that chose to hide rather than disappear. 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City, where the Pyramid of the Sun catches the first light of dawn, something stirs beneath your feet. A low vibration, too rhythmic to be natural, too ancient to be machine. Local workers have heard it for generations. Archaeologists measure it but cannot explain it. The earth itself seems to be breathing, as if something vast and patient waits below. In 2017, the same technology that revealed hidden chambers in Egypt's pyramids turned its gaze toward Teotihuacan. What it found should have rewritten history books. Vast geometric chambers, tunnels that stretch for miles in perfect straight lines. An underground city that mirrors the one above, but older, deeper, and far more sophisticated than anything the textbooks dare to acknowledge. So before you settle in tonight, ask yourself, what else might be sleeping beneath the places we think we know? And what happens when the sleeping gods of Mexico decide it's time to wake? Just 30 miles northeast of Mexico City's sprawling metropolis, where modern highways give way to desert silence, Teotihuacan rises from the earth like a fever dream made stone. But this ancient wonder is more than the remnants of a lost civilization. It's a riddle that breathes. In the hushed moments before dawn, when the first golden rays touch the apex of the Pyramid of the Sun, you can feel it. A subtle tremor beneath your feet. Not the rumble of distant traffic or the pulse of machinery, but something deeper, more primal. The very ground seems to exhale, as if the earth itself were drawing breath after a long, dreamless sleep. These aren't the whispers of desert wind threading through ancient stones. This is something else entirely. Local workers have known it for generations, speaking in hushed tones about the way certain sections of the ruins seem to hum at dawn and dusk. Archaeologists have measured it, recorded it, debated it in academic journals. Yet none have been able to explain why the bedrock beneath one of humanity's most magnificent ancient sites pulses with a rhythm that defies geological logic. The sensation is subtle enough that many visitors dismiss it, attributing the tremor to imagination or the weight of standing in such a historically charged place. But in 2017, science finally caught up with intuition when a research team from UNAM, Mexico's national university, turned their most sophisticated instruments toward this mystery. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a particle physicist who had previously worked on detecting hidden chambers within Egypt's Great Pyramid, brought muon tomography to the windswept plateaus of central Mexico. This revolutionary technology, which uses cosmic ray particles to peer through solid matter like an X-ray through flesh, had already stunned the archaeological world by revealing secret voids within Giza's ancient monuments. Now, Vasquez and her colleague Dr. Carlos Mendoza aimed this same penetrating gaze beneath the Avenue of the Dead, Teotihuacan's main ceremonial thoroughfare. What their instruments revealed should have made headlines around the world. Massive geometric voids stretched beneath the ancient city like the chambers of some colossal heart. These weren't random caves or natural formations carved by underground rivers. The shapes were too precise, too intentional, rectangular chambers larger than cathedral naves, tunnels that ran in perfectly straight lines for kilometers, parallel to the city's main axis above. The geometric precision was so exact that it seemed almost engineered, as if some ancient architect had designed not just the monuments that rose toward the sky, but an entire mirror city that descended into darkness, Officially, these discoveries were catalogued as unexplored natural geological features. The phrase appeared in every press release, every academic paper, every government statement about the findings. But nature rarely architects kilometer-long corridors in perfectly straight lines. Nature doesn't carve rectangular chambers with corners so precise they could have been cut with laser guidance. And nature certainly doesn't arrange underground voids in patterns that mirror the sacred geometry of the monuments above. Dr. Vasquez knew what she had found beneath Teotihuacan was extraordinary, but the political machinery of archaeology moved quickly to contain the implications. Within weeks of submitting her preliminary findings, she received a visit from officials representing Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. The conversation, she later confided to close colleagues, was polite but unmistakably firm. Further investigation would require permissions that might take years to secure. The site's structural integrity could be compromised by deeper probing. Tourism revenue was at stake. The official narrative needed to remain clean, digestible, safe. Yet the data couldn't be buried as easily as the chambers themselves. In quiet academic circles, word spread of what lay beneath Mexico's most famous archaeological site. Whispers traveled through conferences and private emails, carried by researchers who understood that some discoveries are too significant to announce and too important to ignore. The underground city that Vasquez had glimpsed through cosmic rays continued to pulse beneath their feet, patient as stone, mysterious as the civilization that had built it. What troubled Dr. Mendoza most weren't the official denials or the bureaucratic roadblocks. It was the precision. The chambers weren't randomly scattered beneath Teotihuacan like natural caves, formed by water erosion over millennia. They followed a pattern, a deliberate design that suggested not just engineering skill, but profound astronomical knowledge. The main underground corridor aligned perfectly with the Avenue of the Dead above, while smaller passages branched off at angles that corresponded to significant celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and the rising points of Venus and the Pleiades. Someone had built a mirror city beneath the monuments, a shadow realm that reflected the cosmic order the ancient Teotihuacanos had carved into their temples above ground. But who were these builders? When had they lived? And most unsettling of all, why had they chosen to bury their greatest achievements so deep that only 21st century technology could detect them? As night settled over the ancient ruins and the last tourists departed, the questions seemed to echo through the darkness, rising from chambers that had waited centuries for someone to ask them. But before answers could emerge from the earth, the whispers of history would first have to break through the silence of stone. The obsidian spoke first. Long before modern instruments could peer beneath Teotihuacan's ancient stones, the volcanic glass whispered its secrets to those who knew how to listen. In 1906, as the Mexican Revolution simmered on the horizon and the world still believed archaeology was merely treasure hunting, a determined scholar named Eduardo Ramirez began what would become the most extensive excavation in Teotihuacan's modern history. Working under the blazing sun of central Mexico, Ramirez directed crews around the Pyramid of the Moon, methodically clearing centuries of accumulated earth and debris from the monument's base. It was during these painstaking efforts that Ramirez first noticed something extraordinary. As his workers struck certain sections of exposed obsidian blocks with their metal tools, the sound that returned wasn't the solid thunk of stone hitting stone. Instead, a hollow reverberation echoed back, as if their hammers were knocking on the door of some vast empty space hidden beneath their feet. Ramirez, trained in the scientific methods of his era, began keeping meticulous notes of these acoustic anomalies. His field journal, written in careful Spanish script, recorded observation after observation. When striking the northeastern obsidian face, the sound carries for several seconds, suggesting considerable void space below. The entries continued for months, documenting a pattern that defied explanation. These weren't random geological quirks. The hollow sounds occurred at specific locations, forming what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement around the pyramid's base. Ramirez documented each discovery with the precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted territory. His sketches showed acoustic anomalies clustering near what he termed ceremonial access points, areas where the pyramid's builders had incorporated specially cut obsidian blocks into the structure's foundation. For 3 years, Ramirez continued his careful documentation, building a comprehensive map of underground voids that seemed to extend far beyond the pyramid itself. His journal entries grew increasingly excited as the pattern became clear. Beneath Teotihuacan lay what could only be described as a vast architectural network, a shadow city that mirrored the grandeur of the monuments above. But Ramirez's work came to an abrupt halt in 1910 when political upheaval swept through Mexico. The revolution that had been brewing finally erupted, and archaeological expeditions became impossible luxuries in a nation fighting for its future. When peace finally returned to central Mexico, Ramirez had vanished from the historical record. Some said he had fled to Europe, others claimed he had joined one of the revolutionary factions. His extensive field notes, sketches, and acoustic maps were quietly filed away in the archives of the Mexican Institute of Anthropology, where they gathered dust for the better part of a century. The obsidian blocks continued their patient vigil, holding their secrets close, while the world above forgot how to hear their hollow songs. It wasn't until 2003 that Dr. Patricia Morales, a young archivist working on digitizing historical documents, stumbled across Ramirez's forgotten journals. What she found astonished her. Page after page of meticulous observations, detailed sketches of acoustic patterns, and hand-drawn maps showing the locations of underground voids. The precision of his work was remarkable, especially considering the primitive tools available to him a century earlier. Morales immediately brought the documents to the attention of her supervisor, Dr. Ignacio Torres, who recognized their potential significance. Torres understood that Ramirez's acoustic observations could finally be tested using modern ground-penetrating radar technology. Within months, he had assembled a team of geophysicists and archaeologists to return to the exact locations Ramirez had mapped. The results were staggering. Every hollow sound that Ramirez had documented in 1906 corresponded precisely to underground voids detected by 21st century instruments. The old archaeologist hadn't been hearing echoes of his imagination. He had been listening to the heartbeat of a buried civilization, chambers and corridors that stretched beneath Teotihuacan like the circulatory system of some sleeping giant. But the true scope of what lay beneath only became clear when Torres's team began dropping sensitive microphones into small fissures in the obsidian blocks. The sounds that returned defied all expectations. Instead of brief echoes that lasted a second or two, their instruments recorded reverberations that continued for 15, sometimes 20 seconds. The acoustic signature suggested chambers of cathedral-like proportions, spaces so vast that sound waves required nearly half a minute to travel, their full dimensions, and return. Some of these underground halls appeared to be arranged in perfect geometric patterns, mirroring the stellar configurations that had guided Teotihuacan's builders in laying out their monuments above ground. The obsidian wasn't just telling stories of empty space. It was revealing architecture on a scale that rivaled anything visible on the surface, a hidden city that seemed to follow the same cosmic blueprints that had shaped the pyramids and temples tourists marveled at each day. Yet, for all their technological sophistication, Torres and his colleagues found themselves facing the same bureaucratic walls that had frustrated researchers for generations. The question wasn't whether an underground civilization existed beneath their feet, but whether anyone in power wanted the world to know about it. History has always been written by the victors, but sometimes the defeated leave messages in places the conquerors never think to look. When Spanish conquistadors swept through central Mexico in the 16th century, they brought with them not only soldiers and horses, but also scribes and missionaries whose job was to document the conversion of a continent. Among these was Friar Antonio Delgado, a Franciscan monk whose zealous commitment to recording indigenous beliefs would inadvertently preserve some of the most extraordinary claims about Teotihuacan ever committed to paper. Delgado arrived at the ruins in 1547, 26 years after Cortés had toppled the Aztec Empire. By then, Teotihuacan had been abandoned for nearly 6 centuries, its pyramids rising from grassland like monuments to some forgotten dream. The local Nahua peoples still remembered stories about the place, fragments of older memories passed down through generations of oral tradition. In his carefully maintained journal, written in elegant Latin script, Delgado recorded what the elders told him. This is the place where the gods gathered to create the new sun after the old world was destroyed by flood and fire. But it was the censored passages, the notes Delgado wrote and then crossed out, that would prove most intriguing to later scholars. In margins and between official lines, he scribbled references to something that clearly troubled his Christian sensibilities: underground temples where ancient masters had supposedly hidden their knowledge before vanishing from the earth. The indigenous informants spoke of these subterranean sanctuaries with a reverence that bordered on fear, describing elaborate rituals conducted in chambers that lay beneath the very pyramids the Spanish now used as landmarks for their own territorial surveys. What Delgado couldn't have known was that his informants possessed something far more concrete than oral traditions. Hidden away from Spanish eyes, a handful of pre-Columbian codices had survived the systematic burning of indigenous books that accompanied the conquest. One of these, known today as the Codex Xolotl, after the Aztec god of lightning and death, contained detailed pictographic maps that seemed to chart not the surface geography of Teotihuacan, but something far more mysterious. The codex depicted spiraling pathways that descended into darkness, chambers arranged in labyrinthine patterns, and at the center of it all, the unmistakable feathered serpent symbol of Quetzalcoatl, standing guard over what appeared to be an entrance. For centuries, scholars who encountered these images dismissed them as religious allegory, symbolic representations of underworld mythology common throughout Mesoamerican spiritual traditions. The spiral paths, they argued, represented the soul's journey after death. The underground chambers were metaphors for spiritual transformation. The feathered serpent was simply fulfilling its traditional role as guardian between worlds. This comfortable academic consensus held firm until 2019, when Dr. Amanda Foster, a comparative mythology professor from Stanford University, made a discovery that would force scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about pre-Columbian cartography. Foster had spent years studying the mathematical precision hidden within Mesoamerican codices, particularly their use of astronomical alignments and architectural proportions. While examining high-resolution digital scans of the Codex Xolotl, she noticed something that previous researchers had overlooked. The spiral pathways weren't abstract religious symbols, but precise geometric constructions that followed specific mathematical ratios. Intrigued by this discovery, Foster reached out to her colleague, Dr. James Caldwell, a geophysicist who had been part of the team conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys at Teotihuacan. When they overlaid the codex diagrams onto the radar data, the results were nothing short of extraordinary. The spiral pathways depicted in the ancient manuscript corresponded exactly to curved tunnels that modern instruments had detected beneath the Avenue of the Dead. The rectangular chambers shown in the codex matched the underground voids that scientific equipment had mapped with surgical precision. The implications were staggering. If the Codex Xolotl was indeed a literal map, rather than religious symbolism, it meant that pre-Columbian peoples had possessed detailed knowledge of Teotihuacan's underground architecture centuries before modern technology could detect it. More troubling still was what this suggested about the nature of that knowledge. The Codex didn't depict these chambers as natural caves or storage spaces, but as purposefully constructed temples and ceremonial halls, places where the ancient masters hid their wisdom before the Great Forgetting. Foster and Caldwell immediately applied for excavation permits that would allow them to test their hypothesis through careful archaeological investigation. Their proposal was comprehensive, scientifically sound, and backed by some of the most compelling evidence ever assembled about Teotihuacan's hidden layers. The response from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History came swiftly and without explanation. Denied. The official reason cited structural preservation concerns, but no engineering assessment had been requested or conducted. The real message was clear. Some doors were meant to remain closed, some maps were meant to stay lost, and some ancient secrets were considered too dangerous for the modern world to handle. But forbidden knowledge has a way of surfacing when the time is right, and the feathered serpent guarding the entrance might not sleep forever. Sound has a memory. It remembers the shape of the spaces it fills, the materials it touches, the intentions of those who first gave it voice. At Teotihuacan, this memory runs deeper than most places on Earth, encoded not just in the monuments that rise toward the sky, but in the very bones of the bedrock beneath. What modern acoustics engineers are only beginning to understand, the builders of this ancient city may have mastered centuries before the first European ever heard of the New World. The revelation began in 1994, when Dr. Marcos Rodriguez, an acoustic engineer from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, arrived at Chichen Itza with a simple hypothesis. He had read reports of strange acoustic phenomena at Maya sites, echoes that seemed too precise to be accidental, reverberations that mimicked natural sounds in ways that defied conventional explanation. When Rodriguez clapped his hands at the base of the pyramid of Kukulcán, the echo that returned was unmistakable. The sharp, distinctive call of the Quetzal bird, sacred to the Maya and associated with their feathered serpent deity. The discovery made headlines in archaeological journals, but Rodriguez knew he had only scratched the surface of something far more profound. If the Maya had deliberately engineered acoustic effects into their pyramids, what about their predecessors at Teotihuacan? The following year, Rodriguez made the journey to central Mexico, bringing with him an array of sensitive recording equipment and a growing conviction that ancient Mesoamericans understood sound in ways that modern science was only beginning to appreciate. What Rodriguez found at the Pyramid of the Moon exceeded his most ambitious expectations. Unlike the single, sharp echo at Chichen Itza, Teotihuacan's acoustic phenomena were layered and complex, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of harmonic engineering. When he positioned his equipment at the pyramid's apex and generated test tones, the structure responded like a massive musical instrument. Sound waves didn't simply bounce off the limestone surfaces. They were captured, amplified, and channeled through what appeared to be a network of internal acoustic chambers that had never been officially documented. The frequency response was particularly intriguing. While most of the pyramid's acoustic activity occurred in ranges audible to human ears, Rodriguez's instruments detected a powerful resonance at exactly 16 hertz, a frequency below the threshold of human hearing, but well within the range known to affect human consciousness. This infrasonic vibration, barely perceptible as sound, could induce feelings of unease, spiritual presence, or altered awareness in people exposed to it for extended periods. Modern research had linked similar frequencies to reports of paranormal experiences in supposedly haunted locations, suggesting that the pyramid builders had stumbled upon, or deliberately harnessed, a fundamental principle of consciousness manipulation. But Rodriguez's most startling discovery came when he expanded his investigation beyond the pyramid itself to include the surrounding plaza and underground anomalies that radar surveys had detected. Working with Dr. Carmen Elizondo, an electromagnetic specialist from the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, Rodriguez began measuring the electrical activity in the soil around Teotihuacan's monuments. What they found challenged every assumption about ancient engineering capabilities. The underground tunnels weren't just empty spaces carved from bedrock. They appeared to function as sophisticated waveguides, channels specifically designed to transmit acoustic energy across vast distances with minimal loss of signal strength. When Rodriguez generated test tones at the Pyramid of the Moon, Elizondo's instruments detected corresponding electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from tunnel systems hundreds of meters away. The effect was so pronounced that they could trace the underground network simply by following the electromagnetic signatures that sound waves produced as they traveled through the buried chambers. The entire complex appeared to be designed as a massive resonance system, with the visible pyramids serving as acoustic transmitters and the hidden underground city functioning as an enormous amplification chamber. The implications were staggering. If their measurements were accurate, Teotihuacan hadn't simply been a ceremonial center or residential complex. It had been an acoustic instrument on a scale that modern engineering had never attempted. A city-sized machine designed to manipulate sound, consciousness, and perhaps reality itself. The ancient Maya had a term for this phenomenon. Eu then luum, the voice of the earth. For generations, scholars had interpreted this phrase as poetic metaphor, a spiritual way of describing natural phenomena like wind through caves or water flowing over stone. But as Rodriguez and Elizondo compiled their data, a different interpretation began to emerge. What if the voice of the earth wasn't metaphor at all, but literal description? What if the builders of Teotihuacan had discovered that the planet itself could be made to sing, that geological formations could be engineered to amplify and focus acoustic energy in ways that affected human consciousness on a massive scale? The research team's findings suggested that every major pyramid, every ceremonial plaza, every carefully aligned causeway had been positioned not just according to astronomical observations, but according to acoustic principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The underground city wasn't separate from the monuments above. It was their foundation, the hidden resonance chamber that gave voice to stone and geometry. Standing on the Avenue of the Dead at sunset, feeling the subtle vibration that rose from beneath the ancient pavement, Rodriguez began to suspect that Teotihuacan's builders hadn't just created architecture. They had created an instrument capable of bridging the gap between matter and consciousness, between the physical world and the realm of dreams. But such power, once awakened, might prove difficult to control, and the question remained whether modern humanity was prepared for what the ancients had learned to unleash. Water leaves its fingerprints on everything it touches. In limestone, it carves memories that last for millennia. In soil, it creates pathways that endure long after the last drop has evaporated. At Teotihuacan, these fingerprints tell a story that contradicts everything the modern world believes about this ancient site. Today, the Valley of Mexico is a study in aridity, where the thin Rio San Juan struggles to maintain its course through increasingly parched earth. But beneath the dusty surface, geological evidence whispers of a very different past, when this land pulsed with the lifeblood of a sophisticated hydraulic civilization. The transformation began around 2,000 years ago, when climate shifts and human intervention slowly drained the complex network of rivers, springs, and seasonal lakes that once made central Mexico a garden. What remained visible to modern eyes was only the shadow of what had been. A small river meandering through desert, occasional seasonal pools, and the enigmatic monuments that seemed to have been built in defiance of their harsh environment. But water, unlike human memory, doesn't simply vanish without a trace. It leaves behind geological signatures, mineral deposits, and underground channels that persist long after the surface has forgotten their purpose. In 2020, Dr. Angela Roswell, a hydrogeologist from UC Berkeley, brought a team of specialists to Teotihuacan armed with electrical resistivity imaging equipment, technology capable of mapping subsurface water systems with extraordinary precision. What Roswell and her colleague, Dr. Timothy Hayward, discovered beneath the ancient city challenged every assumption about pre-Columbian engineering capabilities. The electrical readings revealed an intricate network of aquifers and channels that stretched for kilometers beneath the monuments, creating a hidden hydraulic infrastructure of staggering complexity. These weren't natural watercourses carved by random geological processes. The underground streams followed geometric patterns with mathematical precision, intersecting at specific angles and converging at points that corresponded exactly to the locations where ground-penetrating radar had detected the largest underground chambers. Most remarkably, the water channels seemed to have been deliberately engineered to create what Roswell termed hydraulic nodes, points where multiple streams merged to generate increased water pressure and flow velocity. These nodes aligned perfectly with the ceremonial centers above ground, suggesting that the visible city had been constructed according to the blueprint of an invisible water-based infrastructure that most modern engineers would struggle to design, even with contemporary technology. The implications were profound. If Teotihuacan's builders had possessed such sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering, then the underground chambers weren't simply storage spaces or tombs. They were functional components of a water management system that may have served purposes far beyond anything archaeologists had previously imagined. The discovery took on even deeper significance when Roswell's team began comparing their findings to the mythological traditions that had survived from pre-Columbian times. Ancient Aztec cosmology spoke of Tlaloc, the rain god who ruled over an underground kingdom called Tlalocan, literally translated as the place where water flows eternally. According to the Codex Borgia, one of the few indigenous manuscripts to survive Spanish conquest, Tlalocan was depicted not as a spiritual realm, but as a physical location, a vast labyrinth of waterways that led to what the texts described as the heart of the world. For centuries, scholars had dismissed these descriptions as religious metaphor, symbolic representations of the afterlife that bore no relationship to actual geography. But when Roswell overlaid the hydraulic network her instruments had detected onto traditional maps of Tlalocan found in surviving codices, the correlation was undeniable. The branching patterns of underground water channels matched the artistic depictions of the rain god's domain with startling accuracy. Even more intriguingly, the heart of the world mentioned in ancient texts appeared to correspond to the largest hydraulic convergence point detected by modern instruments, a massive underground intersection located directly beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, where multiple water channels merged in a complex pattern that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural formation. As Roswell's research progressed, she began to suspect that the underground water system had served functions far more sophisticated than simple irrigation or storage. The hydraulic nodes created pressure differentials that could have been used to power mechanical devices, while the strategic placement of water channels beneath acoustic chambers suggested a possible connection to the sound manipulation technology that other researchers had detected. Moving water generates subtle electromagnetic fields, and when channeled through specifically designed chambers, it could create the kind of environmental conditions that affect human consciousness. Altered atmospheric pressure, infrasonic vibrations, and electromagnetic fluctuations that might induce mystical experiences or heightened awareness. Most remarkably, the entire system appeared to have functioned as a primitive form of climate control, using the thermal mass of underground water to regulate temperature throughout the city. The network wasn't just hydraulic engineering, it was environmental engineering on a scale that modern cities struggle to achieve. But such sophisticated technology raises unsettling questions about what happened to the knowledge that created it, and whether the underground systems are still functional, waiting beneath the desert like sleeping arteries in the body of a dreaming giant. There are truths that institutions cannot afford to acknowledge, discoveries that threaten the careful narratives upon which entire academic disciplines have been built. At Teotihuacan, these inconvenient revelations have a way of vanishing into bureaucratic labyrinths as complex as any underground chamber, buried beneath layers of permits, regulations, and official denials that protect the established order more effectively than any ancient seal. The machinery of suppression operates with clockwork precision, ensuring that some doors remain locked not because they're empty, but because they're too full of implications that the modern world isn't ready to absorb. The pattern began in 1963, when a joint Mexican-American archaeological team, led by Dr. Fernando Valencia, conducted the most comprehensive survey of Teotihuacan attempted up to that time. Valencia, working with funding from both the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and the Smithsonian Institution, had assembled an impressive array of specialists, archaeologists, geologists, engineers, and for the first time at the site, specialists in underground exploration and cave mapping. The official mission was straightforward: create a definitive map of Teotihuacan's surface monuments and their relationship to the surrounding landscape. But Valencia's private journals, discovered decades later in his family's archives, tell a different story. Within weeks of beginning their survey, the team had identified what Valencia described as clear evidence of subsurface architectural features near the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Ground-penetrating equipment, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for its time, had detected what appeared to be entrance shafts leading to large underground chambers. Valencia's excitement was palpable in his personal notes. "We stand on the threshold of the most significant archaeological discovery in Mexican history." The enthusiasm proved short-lived. Within days of submitting preliminary findings to both Mexican authorities and American funding agencies, Valencia received visits from officials representing Mexico's Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia. The conversations, according to Valencia's cryptic journal entries, were cordial but firm. Further subsurface investigation would require additional permits that could take months or years to obtain. The structural integrity of the monuments might be compromised by excavation. Tourism revenue was at stake. Most importantly, any findings would need to be reviewed and approved by multiple government agencies before publication. Valencia's team was quietly reassigned to surface mapping projects, and the underground anomalies were reclassified as geological features requiring further study at an unspecified future date. When the expedition's final report was published in 1965, it contained comprehensive documentation of every visible monument at Teotihuacan, but made no mention whatsoever of the subsurface discoveries that had originally generated such excitement among the research team. The pattern of discovery followed by silence would repeat itself with disturbing regularity over the following decades, creating a shadow archive of suppressed findings that existed only in private correspondence and unofficial records. The most dramatic example emerged in the late 1990s when rumors began circulating through international archaeological circles about something called Proyecto Subterráneo, a clandestine research initiative allegedly funded by a consortium of European universities and private foundations. According to sources who spoke only on condition of anonymity, the project had used advanced drilling and imaging technology to penetrate one of the largest underground chambers detected beneath the Avenue of the Dead. Dr. Isabelle Dumont, a French archaeologist who reportedly coordinated the effort, was said to have transmitted initial findings that described architectural features inconsistent with known pre-Columbian construction techniques. The project's existence was never officially confirmed, but multiple independent sources reported that all research activities ceased abruptly in early 1999. Equipment was removed from the site overnight, personnel scattered to different continents, and all participants signed comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that effectively ended their careers in Mexican archaeology. Dumont herself disappeared from academic circles entirely, with colleagues reporting only that she had retired from fieldwork for personal reasons. Funding for the consortium dried up within months, and no trace of the research data has ever surfaced in academic databases or professional publications. Yet the absence of official records hasn't prevented stories from filtering through less formal channels, carried by the local workers who maintain Teotihuacan's grounds and the indigenous families whose ancestors have lived in the shadow of the pyramids for countless generations. These unofficial accounts speak of strange activities that continue to this day. Unmarked vehicles arriving at the archaeological zone during closed hours, sophisticated drilling equipment appearing and disappearing without explanation, and work crews who speak languages that locals don't recognize. One groundskeeper, who asked that his name not be used, described witnessing men in white coats taking measurements near sealed sections of the site during a supposed maintenance closure in 2018. Security cameras, he noted, were mysteriously offline during the entire period. The institutional response to such reports follows a predictable pattern: polite dismissal, followed by quiet reassignment of any employee who speaks too freely about unusual activities. The message is clear. Some aspects of Teotihuacan's ongoing research remain off-limits to public scrutiny, protected by layers of bureaucracy that seem designed more to obscure than to preserve. Perhaps the most telling evidence of continued suppression lies not in what officials say, but in what they refuse to say. When pressed about underground anomalies, representatives of Mexico's archaeological establishment invariably respond with the same carefully rehearsed phrase: "There are no confirmed subsurface structures at Teotihuacan requiring investigation." The emphasis on confirmed speaks volumes about discoveries that remain deliberately unconfirmed, waiting in darkness for a time when the world might be ready for truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Mathematics doesn't lie. It can't be bribed, intimidated, or convinced to alter its testimony for political convenience. When applied to Teotihuacan's architecture, mathematics reveals patterns so precise, so intentionally encoded, that they transform the entire site from a collection of ancient monuments into something far more extraordinary: a three-dimensional equation written in stone, a cosmic calculator designed to measure relationships between Earth and sky that modern astronomy has only recently begun to understand. The first person to recognize these mathematical fingerprints was Dr. Olivia Harrington, a structural engineer from MIT who arrived at Teotihuacan in 1987 with a simple goal: to understand how pre-Columbian builders had achieved such remarkable stability in their massive stone constructions. Harrington expected to find evidence of sophisticated engineering techniques, but what she discovered was evidence of something that seemed almost impossible for a civilization supposedly working without advanced mathematical tools. Working with obsessive precision, Harrington spent 4 years measuring every accessible angle, distance, and proportion at Teotihuacan. What emerged from her calculations was a unified measurement system that she termed the Standard Teotihuacan Unit, a length of exactly 1.0594 meters that appeared consistently throughout the site's architecture. But this wasn't simply a convenient building standard. The STU encoded mathematical relationships that connected Teotihuacan's monuments to fundamental cosmic proportions in ways that suggested knowledge far beyond what conventional archaeology attributed to pre-Columbian civilizations. The most startling discovery came when Harrington calculated the distance from the Pyramid of the Sun to the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. When measured in STUs and multiplied by a specific mathematical constant, the result yielded the exact circumference of Earth at the equator. Similarly, the height of the Pyramid of the Moon, when expressed in the same units and subjected to the same mathematical operations, produced Earth's polar radius with an accuracy that modern satellite measurements had only achieved in the late 20th century. Even more remarkably, the architectural proportions encoded fundamental mathematical constants that European mathematics wouldn't formally recognize until the Renaissance. The ratio between the pyramid's base and height incorporated both pi and the golden ratio phi, while the angles of key ceremonial structures aligned with stellar observations that required knowledge of Earth's axial precession, a 26,000-year cycle that ancient astronomers supposedly couldn't have detected without instruments that wouldn't be invented for another millennium. But Harrington's most profound insight came when she began applying the STU system to the underground anomalies that radar surveys had detected beneath the visible monuments. The subsurface chambers weren't randomly distributed. They followed the same geometric principles that governed the architecture above ground, creating what appeared to be a three-dimensional mandala that extended both upward into the sky and downward into the earth. The depth and spacing of underground voids corresponded to the same mathematical ratios that connected surface monuments to celestial bodies, suggesting that Teotihuacan's builders had conceived their city as a complete cosmological model. The implications challenged every assumption about ancient intellectual capabilities. If pre-Columbian architects had possessed such sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering, then the underground city wasn't an afterthought or storage facility. It was an integral component of a unified design that used geometric principles to create harmony between human consciousness, terrestrial forces, and cosmic rhythms. The ancient Nahuatl term for Teotihuacan translates as the place where humans become gods, a phrase that scholars had always interpreted metaphorically, but which might describe a literal transformation achieved through geometric resonance and environmental manipulation. Harrington's research suggested that the entire complex functioned as a consciousness-altering device, using mathematical principles to create specific electromagnetic and acoustic conditions that could induce heightened awareness or mystical experiences in those who understood how to activate its systems. The geometric patterns extended far beyond Teotihuacan itself. When Harrington plotted the site's coordinates on global maps and applied the same mathematical principles she had discovered in its architecture, she found that Teotihuacan aligned with other sacred sites around the world along what appeared to be a planetary grid of geometric relationships. The distances between Teotihuacan and locations like Easter Island, Angkor Wat, and the Giza pyramids followed the same proportional ratios that governed the spacing of chambers within individual monuments, suggesting that ancient builders had conceived of their constructions not as isolated temples, but as components in a worldwide network of geometric harmonization. The implications were staggering. If such a network had ever been functional, it would have represented a form of planetary consciousness technology using architecture and landscape to create resonance fields that connected human awareness to cosmic rhythms on a global scale. Standing at the center of Teotihuacan's geometric mandala, feeling the subtle vibrations that rose from underground chambers perfectly tuned to celestial mathematics, one couldn't help but wonder whether the ancient gods had been technological rather than spiritual entities, and whether their sleeping city was waiting not for excavation, but for reactivation by minds capable of remembering how consciousness itself could be engineered through stone and number. Obsidian is more than volcanic glass. It is crystallized lightning, Earth's memory of fire frozen in perfect molecular order. At Teotihuacan, obsidian wasn't simply a material for tools and weapons. It was integrated into the very architecture of consciousness manipulation, embedded in walls and floors according to patterns that modern science is only beginning to understand. The ancient peoples of Mesoamerica considered obsidian sacred not because of superstition, but because they had discovered properties of this remarkable material that 21st century physics is just starting to recognize. Dr. Rachel Pemberton, a materials scientist from Caltech, who specializes in the electromagnetic properties of natural crystals, first became interested in Teotihuacan's obsidian in 2018 while researching piezoelectric effects in geological formations. Piezoelectricity, the ability of certain materials to generate electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, occurs naturally in quartz crystals, but Pemberton's preliminary tests suggested that obsidian might exhibit similar properties under specific conditions. What brought her to central Mexico wasn't archaeology, but engineering curiosity. If obsidian could indeed generate electrical fields when arranged in particular geometric patterns, then Teotihuacan's builders might have unknowingly created what amounted to a massive bioelectrical interface, a structure capable of interacting with the human nervous system through subtle electromagnetic manipulation. The possibility seemed far-fetched until Pemberton began examining the specific ways obsidian had been incorporated into Teotihuacan's underground chambers, where electromagnetic scans had detected unusual patterns of metallic concentration. Working with ground-penetrating radar data provided by earlier archaeological surveys, Pemberton identified locations where obsidian deposits appeared to be concentrated in geometric arrays beneath the major monuments. These weren't random distributions of volcanic glass scattered by natural processes. The patterns were too regular, too precisely aligned with the architectural features above ground to be accidental. When she calculated the electromagnetic fields that such arrays would generate under various conditions, temperature changes, seismic activity, even the gravitational effects of celestial bodies, the results suggested that these underground obsidian formations could function as natural electromagnetic resonators. The implications became even more intriguing when Pemberton learned that many indigenous traditions throughout Mesoamerica described obsidian as a material that could thin the veil between worlds. Modern neurological research had shown that exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies could indeed alter brain states, inducing everything from mild euphoria to profound mystical experiences. If Teotihuacan's builders had discovered these effects empirically, they might have used obsidian arrays to create controlled environments for consciousness exploration. The concept wasn't as outlandish as it initially seemed. Dr. Thomas Kellner, an anthropologist from UC San Diego who had studied shamanic practices throughout Mexico, documented numerous indigenous ceremonies that specifically incorporated obsidian mirrors and blades in rituals designed to induce altered states of consciousness. According to Kellner's research, Traditional healers described obsidian as a material that could tune the mind like a musical instrument, allowing practitioners to access levels of awareness normally hidden from ordinary perception. When Pemberton compared these ethnographic accounts with her electromagnetic measurements, she found striking correlations. The frequencies generated by obsidian formations under stress matched the brainwave patterns associated with deep meditation and visionary experiences, specifically the theta and gamma rhythms that modern neuroscience linked to expanded consciousness and mystical states. The underground chambers detected by radar weren't just storage spaces or ceremonial halls. They were sophisticated consciousness laboratories, environments where obsidian arrays could interact with human bioelectricity to facilitate psychological and spiritual transformation. The ancient Nahuatl word for these spaces, Teotihuacan, literally meant house of God, but perhaps referred not to religious worship, but to a technology for accessing divine states of consciousness through electromagnetic manipulation. Standing above these hidden chambers, feeling the subtle electrical field that sensitive instruments could detect rising from the buried obsidian arrays, Pemberton began to understand that Teotihuacan represented something unprecedented in human history. It wasn't simply an ancient city or ceremonial center, but a prototype for consciousness technology, a systematic attempt to engineer human awareness using the electromagnetic properties of natural materials and the geometric principles of sacred architecture. Modern research into consciousness had only recently begun to explore the relationship between electromagnetic fields and mental states. But Teotihuacan's builders seemed to have mastered these principles centuries before the scientific method existed. The obsidian arrays, the acoustic chambers, the water channels, and the geometric alignments all worked together as components in a unified system designed to facilitate what could only be described as technological mysticism, the use of engineered environments to induce controlled transcendent experiences. The question that haunted Pemberton wasn't whether such technology had been possible in ancient times, but whether modern humanity was prepared to rediscover it. If consciousness could indeed be manipulated through electromagnetic fields and acoustic resonance, if human awareness could be systematically expanded through exposure to specific environmental conditions, then the underground chambers of Teotihuacan might represent more than historical curiosities. They might be dormant laboratories waiting to be reactivated, obsidian arrays that still hummed with potential energy, ready to resume their ancient function of transforming human consciousness for those brave enough to descend into darkness and remember what it means to become divine. But some technologies, once awakened, might prove impossible to control, and the question remained whether the modern world was ready for the kind of transformation that the sleeping gods of Mexico had once made possible. Memory lives in unexpected places. It survives in the songs that grandmothers sing to children, in the dreams that come to those who sleep too close to ancient stones, in the quiet knowledge passed between healers who still remember what the world was like before forgetting became a virtue. At Teotihuacan, this living memory flows through bloodlines that stretch back to the builders themselves, carried by indigenous communities whose ancestors never truly left the shadow of the pyramids, even when history tried to erase their connection to the sleeping city beneath the desert. In the traditional Nahuatl worldview, time doesn't move in straight lines. It spirals, returning to itself in cycles that bring both endings and beginnings. This understanding shapes how indigenous elders speak about Teotihuacan, not as a ruin from the distant past, but as a place where all times exist simultaneously, where the boundaries between what was, what is, and what will be grow thin enough for memory to pass between worlds. Maria Elena Xochitl, a curandera from the nearby village of San Juan Teotihuacan, belongs to a family that has maintained oral traditions about the underground city for more than 20 generations. Her great-grandmother spoke of caminos subterráneos, underground roads, where the spirits of the ancient builders still traveled between chambers of light hidden beneath the earth. These weren't metaphorical journeys, according to family tradition, but actual pathways that could be accessed by those who knew the proper ceremonies and carried the right intentions. Xochitl described rituals that her grandmother had taught her, ceremonies designed to open the ears of the earth and allow communication with the consciousness that slept beneath the pyramids. These practices involved specific chants, offerings of copal incense, and meditative states that could induce what she called dreaming while awake, experiences where participants reported walking through vast underground halls filled with soft, golden light. Dr. Jonathan Winters, an anthropologist from UC Santa Barbara, who had spent years documenting indigenous perspectives on sacred sites throughout Mexico, became intrigued by these consistent reports of underground visions among people living near Teotihuacan. What struck him wasn't just the frequency of such experiences, but their remarkable consistency across different families and communities. The descriptions shared common elements: corridors lined with crystalline formations, chambers where sound took on visible qualities, and encounters with luminous beings who communicated through direct mental contact rather than spoken words. Winters initially approached these accounts with academic skepticism, interpreting them as cultural mythology or psychological phenomena triggered by the emotional impact of living near such an historically significant site. But when he began correlating the locations where these visionary experiences most commonly occurred with the electromagnetic anomalies that scientific instruments had detected, a different pattern emerged. The areas where local residents reported the most vivid underground dreams corresponded precisely to the points where geophysical surveys had detected the strongest electromagnetic signatures from buried chambers. Winters realized that he might be witnessing something more than folklore. He could be documenting the effects of an ancient consciousness technology that was still partially functional, influencing the dreams and perceptions of people who lived within its electromagnetic field. Neurological research conducted at Stanford University had already established that exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies could trigger vivid hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and experiences that subjects often described in spiritual or mystical terms. The phenomenon, known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity in clinical literature, affected approximately 15% of the population with particular intensity. When Winters tested residents of communities near Teotihuacan, he found that nearly 40% exhibited heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, a proportion far higher than the general population. The implications were startling. If Teotihuacan's underground chambers were indeed generating electromagnetic fields through their obsidian arrays and geometric configurations, then the site was still functioning as a consciousness-altering device, affecting the dreams and perceptions of anyone sensitive enough to detect its subtle influence. The indigenous ceremonies that claimed to open communication with the earth might have been sophisticated techniques for enhancing natural electromagnetic sensitivity, allowing practitioners to receive more detailed information from the buried chambers. What the ancestors called communion with spirits, modern science might recognize as bioelectrical interface, a direct connection between human consciousness and the technological systems that ancient engineers had embedded beneath the desert. The distinction between mythology and technology began to blur when viewed from this perspective. Indigenous prophecies that spoke of a time when the heart of the earth will begin beating again might not be spiritual metaphor but technical description, references to the reactivation of consciousness-amplifying systems that had been dormant for centuries. Recent interviews with elderly curanderos throughout central Mexico revealed remarkably consistent accounts of what they called the awakening time, a period when the underground spirits would return to teach humanity forgotten wisdom about the relationship between consciousness and matter. These prophecies, passed down through generations of oral tradition, described signs that many indigenous elders believed were already manifesting: increased seismic activity at ancient sites, changes in local electromagnetic fields, and a growing number of people experiencing spontaneous visionary states near sacred locations. Standing in the shadow of the Pyramid of the Sun at dusk, when the last light faded from the stone faces and the desert air grew charged with possibility, it became easy to imagine that the sleeping consciousness beneath Teotihuacan was indeed stirring. The electromagnetic fields that instruments detected rising from buried chambers pulsed with subtle rhythms that seemed almost organic, like the breathing of some vast intelligence preparing to wake. Perhaps the memory keepers were right, and the underground city wasn't waiting to be excavated but to be remembered, not to be discovered, but to be reconnected with the living world through minds capable of bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Change comes slowly to places where time moves in spirals rather than lines, but when it arrives, it carries the weight of centuries in its wake. At Teotihuacan, the signs of transformation are subtle enough to escape casual notice. Slight variations in ground temperature that satellite thermal imaging has begun detecting. Rhythmic seismic micro-tremors too regular to be tectonic. Electromagnetic fluctuations that seem to pulse in harmony with celestial cycles. To most observers, these phenomena register as statistical anomalies, natural variations within acceptable parameters. But to those who know how to read the language of awakening, they whisper of something profound stirring beneath the ancient stones. Dr. Sofia Méndez Rivera, a geophysicist from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, first noticed these patterns while analyzing long-term seismic data from monitoring stations around central Mexico. What caught her attention wasn't the presence of underground activity. The region had always exhibited mild geological instability, but the mathematical precision of the patterns. The micro-tremors followed cycles that corresponded to lunar phases, solar maximum and minimum periods, and the precession of equinoxes. Natural geological processes rarely exhibited such astronomical correlation. When Méndez Rivera overlaid her seismic data onto maps of Teotihuacan's underground anomalies, the correlation became impossible to ignore. The areas where radar had detected the largest buried chambers were experiencing the most rhythmic activity, as if something deep beneath the earth was beginning to breathe again after centuries of dormancy. The implications troubled her scientific sensibilities, even as they excited her curiosity. Geological formations didn't simply decide to reactivate after lying dormant for millennia, unless they had never been entirely geological to begin with. Indigenous prophecies began to seem less like folklore and more like technical manuals when viewed through the lens of Méndez Rivera's data. The Nahuatl concept of sexto sol, the sixth sun, described a time when ancient wisdom would return to guide humanity through a period of transformation. Traditional accounts spoke of sleeping gods awakening, of underground waters beginning to flow again, of stone temples remembering their original purpose. These descriptions matched remarkably well with what modern instruments were detecting. Increased hydrological activity in underground channels, electromagnetic fluctuations in buried obsidian formations, and acoustic resonances that suggested large hollow spaces responding to subtle environmental changes. The possibility that struck Méndez Rivera as both thrilling and terrifying was that Teotihuacan's consciousness-altering technology might be reactivating itself, triggered by cosmic cycles that its original builders had programmed into the very structure of their underground city. Climate change, increased solar activity, and shifting magnetic fields might be providing the environmental conditions necessary to wake systems that had been waiting centuries for the right moment to resume their ancient function. But the question that haunted Mendez Rivera wasn't whether this reactivation was possible, but whether modern humanity was prepared for what might emerge from the sleeping chambers beneath their feet. The consciousness-altering technology that ancient builders had embedded in Teotihuacan's underground architecture had been designed for a very different kind of human being. People who understood reality as fundamentally interconnected, who experienced consciousness as something that could be shared and manipulated through environmental means, who lived in harmony with cosmic cycles that modern civilization had largely forgotten. If such systems were indeed beginning to function again, they might have effects that contemporary society was ill-equipped to handle or understand. Recent reports from residents living near Teotihuacan suggested that something was already changing. Local schools had documented a significant increase in children experiencing what psychologists cautiously termed enhanced intuitive abilities, spontaneous knowledge of things they had never been taught, vivid dreams that seemed to contain historical information, and an unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. Adults reported similar phenomena: sudden insights into complex problems, experiences of expanded awareness during meditation or sleep, and an increasing sense that the landscape itself was somehow alive and responsive to human consciousness. These accounts might represent the early stages of a transformation that the ancient builders had intended, the awakening of human potential through exposure to consciousness-expanding environmental conditions. Or they might signal something more unpredictable, the uncontrolled activation of systems that were never meant to operate without proper guidance and preparation. Standing at the center of Teotihuacan's ceremonial plaza, as evening shadows lengthen across the ancient stones, one can feel the subtle pulse that rises from the chambers below. Electromagnetic rhythms that seem to synchronize with heartbeat and breath. Acoustic vibrations that resonate in frequencies just below the threshold of hearing. The sleeping city is no longer entirely asleep. And the question facing humanity isn't whether it will fully awaken, but whether we will be ready when it does. The underground chambers detected by modern technology may hold more than archaeological treasures or historical artifacts. They may contain the key to understanding consciousness itself, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a practical technology that can be engineered, enhanced, and shared through environmental manipulation. The builders of Teotihuacan may have left behind not just monuments to their civilization, but tools for the evolution of human awareness. As night falls over the Valley of Mexico and stars emerge in patterns that ancient astronomers used to calibrate their consciousness-altering instruments, the desert whispers its eternal question. Are we ready to remember what we once knew about the relationship between mind and matter, between human awareness and cosmic intelligence? The sleeping gods of Teotihuacan may already be stirring, waiting not for excavation but for recognition, not for discovery, but for the courage to become what we were always meant to be. And so, as the desert wind carries whispers across the stones of Teotihuacan, as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the underground city continues its patient dreaming. The chambers that once resonated with the footsteps of forgotten masters now pulse gently with the slow rhythm of the earth's own heartbeat, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to remember what it means to listen. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let your mind wander through those buried corridors of possibility. Feel the geometric precision of their construction, the harmonic frequencies that once transformed consciousness, the water that still flows through channels carved by hands that understood the deepest mysteries of matter and mind. The sleeping gods of Mexico are not angry or demanding. They are patient, like wise teachers who know that wisdom comes when the student is ready, not when the lesson is taught. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking down spiral pathways lit by a golden glow that comes not from torches, but from the stones themselves. You might discover chambers where sound becomes visible, where thoughts take on weight and substance, where the boundaries between self and cosmos dissolve into something vast and peaceful. These are not places of fear, but of homecoming. Not destinations to be reached, but states to be remembered. Rest now, knowing that beneath your sleeping world, ancient wisdom stirs gently in the darkness, waiting for the dawn when humanity will remember how to build with consciousness itself, how to create harmony between mind and matter, how to become the gods we were always meant to be. Sleep well, and let the dreaming earth carry you safely through the night.